I'm Doug Fernan. This is my take on music recording. In this episode, I talk with my business partners, friends, and superb musicians, George and Geoff Hazelrigg. You know what's amazing is this is the 51st episode of this podcast, and I've never had you guys on up until now.
It's because we've been so busy.
Yeah. And this is, I think, only the second podcast episode I've done where we've actually had everybody in the same room.
Wow, cool.
The only other one I did like that was the one with Joe Tarsia.
Oh, yeah.
Which was pre-pandemic.
Right.
So a couple of firsts here. But I'm really glad that we finally got everybody in the same room, gathered around an AEA 44C. What we want to talk about today is the concept of audio quality. And as I think a lot of people know, Geoff Hazelrigg worked for me for a long time as an assembler, really one of the finest assemblers I've ever had. And his sense of precision, attention to detail, and so on was just always very impressive to me. And that same degree of commitment he shows in his music, and George does as well. And what we discovered as we got to know each other better and talked a lot about things was that we have interchangeable ears.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That we basically never disagree about whether something sounds right or not.
Correct. Even in great detail.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is pretty remarkable. So I wanted to get these guys in here to talk about that and provide some insight into where that skill comes from.
Well, I mean, as anybody who's heard you speak on your podcast about your own experience, I mean, for you, it came from walking around, orchestral rehearsal.
Yeah.
For us, it was a similar scenario. I mean, we were constantly engaging somehow with live acoustic music. I mean, from a very early age. I mean, we spent years singing in a church choir that was a fairly renowned church choir under a great director, John Bertolo in Princeton. And even that, doing that 3 days a week, you're keenly aware of room acoustics, of 1,000 little things that are going on at any moment musically.
Yeah, a lot of details, not just acoustically, but, what we had to bring to the situation. It was, even though it was a kids choir, it wasn't like a kiddie choir like you think of it. I mean, I think I was in third grade when we started doing the choir, and you were expected to act as a professional as much as a grown adult professional.
It was a professional situation.
Right.
We were paid.
Right.
Yeah, and the people that were, the organists, a lot of the adults in the choir, they were from Westminster Choir College or Princeton University or whatever. I mean, they were pretty serious people.
Give me some examples of the things that influenced you from that early time.
So my whole musical career started when I was 3. Our parents were very much into Baroque music at that point in time and had it in their head that they wanted a harpsichordist in the family, and I was it. They commissioned a harpsichord to be built right after I was born, and it arrived when I was 3 years old. We lived in Princeton, and there was a renowned builder in Hopewell, which is the next town over from where we were. My father played a little bit, and he still plays, actually, a bit. He was a pianist to a degree. And he played this Scarlatti piece over and over and over and over and over again. And one day he was playing this piece, and then he got up and went into the other room to watch TV and heard the piece coming from the harpsichord and thought, am I going crazy? And he snuck up behind me, and I had picked out a lot of it by ear. And so I think, for me, from the very beginning, it was very much ear-centric. I had my first serious teacher right about before I turned 5. Dad had this engineering consulting company in Princeton. They were doing aerospace engineering stuff, and they had to hire somebody who would be able to program the computer at the computer lab at Princeton. And of course, there were no computer science majors then. And IBM had done a study to try to figure out what kind of person, what kind of professional was going to be capable of writing code. And the study showed that far and away, musicians were better at picking this stuff up than any other group of people. And my father wound up hiring a grad student from Westminster Choir College in town there to program the computer. He was a organ and harpsichord player, and so my father said, "Look, you're a grad student. That means you're starving to death. I'll make you a deal. You teach my kid twice a week, and I'll feed you all you can eat." And so I was taught from 4 or 5 in a very old school approach. I mean, he was teaching me theory and ear training and intervals and chords and, on top of Bach and Scarlatti and the keyboard aspects of this stuff. It was very intensive in terms of, the ear training stuff. So that's where it began for me. Geoff had somewhat of a similar.
Yeah, I mean, obviously growing up in the same household as all this other music going on. Because, I mean, I don't think George made much of a point about it, but like when our parents had the idea that they were going to have a harpsichordist in the family, that was no joke. I think they were pretty set on that. So I grew up in the house hearing a lot of this music constantly. I didn't start playing violin until maybe I was 5 or 6. And I don't think I really took to it the same kind of way. It helped me get through a lot of the mechanics of music and hearing things and playing an instrument where the pitches aren't fixed. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to hear how do you know when the violinist is not, or what, playing in tune?
Out of tune. How do you know when a violin is out of tune? Right.
Right.
The bow is moving.
Exactly. Anyhow. But you have to be tuned into those things. I didn't particularly enjoy the playing or learning. I think it was just sort of a vehicle to learn to read music, learn to hear, learn the mechanics of an instrument, but not necessarily one that I wanted to devote my life to. So I ended up working through a couple different instruments between essentially the time I was born and the time I left to go to college. A little bit of keyboard, piano instrument stuff in there. I played saxophone for a little while. Obviously the singing. And then I settled on bass, actually electric bass. I didn't really pick up upright bass until maybe 12 years ago or so. So,
yeah, going back to the singing, it's back to the pitch thing, actually. That's the one thing that you really get from singing in a choir is you become keenly aware of pitch, and a few cents in one direction or another makes a big difference. And when you're talking about an entire group of people, the difference between a few cents is an enormous difference.
Right.
And the choir we sang in was a precise, well-oiled machine. Mm-hmm. And I think that really helped us be able to perceive what's going on very finely with pitch.
Yeah, so I think there are two aspects to that, actually. So one is having a good sort of internal sense of pitch and the relationship between pitches. And the second thing is having the situational awareness of what's happening around you, because sometimes the distances between what you're sensing are correct pitches may not fit into the larger picture of things. Mm-hmm. It's like playing in a rock band or a jazz band, having a sense of what's going on around you and what the other musicians are doing.
Yeah, that actually brings up the subject of temperament as well. Mm-hmm, because when you're singing in a choir, and we sang a lot of, it's interesting. This is sort of a musicology thing that I've talked to a couple people about. I'm not educated in this well enough to be able to expand on it, but it seemed to me that there was, especially like in people in the choral field, a group of people who had an affinity for earlier music, Renaissance and early Baroque period music, and then sort of skipped over this classical period right to the 20th century, where those ideals were picked up again and utilized in a completely different context. I mean, by then we're into like Duraflay or Fauré, or these composers, and you can see that there's a huge tie between that 20th century stuff and the 17th century stuff. Temperaments, when you're singing in a group like that, they don't work out to be equal the way we think about that. Being raised as a harpsichordist, we didn't tune that thing equal temperament. It was tuned. My father liked to use Kernberger 3, which Kernberger was a student of Bach's, and that temperament was designed for, a lot of Bach's keyboard works, like the Well-Tempered Clavier. And things sound different in different temperaments, very, very much so. And the relations between chords and different keys and pure intervals changes the whole scope of that stuff. And it gives you a different sense of what in tune is and complexities of music that are just sort of gone when you just iron everything out with the auto tuner.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I realize that. It's funny because you talk about your training starting when you were 4 or 5, and that's about when I did too. Totally different path though, because my father's a classical musician and didn't really encourage, I wouldn't say he actively discouraged, but he certainly made it clear that he didn't want his children going into music. Yeah. But I think as far as temperament's concerned, I think I realized that at a rehearsal one time of the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Academy of Music in Philadelphia, and I was wandering around, as a little kid, and there was a piano soloist, and I'm listening to all this gorgeous music, and, at that time, the Philadelphia Orchestra was like on an entirely different level than any other orchestra as far as their string intonation sound. And that's what I was used to hearing. And of course the rest of the orchestra was also had that same concept. The piano started and it sounded just awful to my ear.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden violinists, any instrument that isn't a keyboard, you can always pull the intonation to where you want it, where it needs to be. As far as I know, there's no keyboard instrument where you can do that. So it was just jarring to me. And I never forgot that. And I still hear it every time I hear a piano with other instruments.
Well, there's an art to that. And the best piano tuners will tune the piano per the repertoire.
Right, exactly.
Because what works for Brahms isn't going to work for, Mozart. These are two different aesthetics or later things, Ravel or whatever. I mean, it's a totally different feel. They stretch octaves a lot to try to get, to get these things to cut through because, you have one single acoustic instrument. I mean, it's 9 feet long, but it's still just one point source on stage that's got to fight 72 people,
right?
Some of them with drums. So you have to try to maximize that. But it's funny. I've always gotten the same feeling out of pianists with orchestras for that too. It's like the piano comes in and it just there's something wrong. It initially feels flat in a way. You kind of have to get your ears to adjust around it. But yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. My exposure as a kid, in addition to the orchestra, was my father had a woodwind quintet that practiced at our house. And I must have been really little because I can remember him in his studio down in the basement. He had finished this all off, very nice with wood paneling and everything. And there were window wells that went from, basement windows that he had lined with wood. And he used to sit me up in there. So how old could I have been to sit in that space? But I was sitting up there, and right below me is Saul Schoenbach, one of the greatest bassoonists that's ever lived, right? Which I think started my infatuation with the bass instruments of all kinds. And John Delancey on oboe, and my father French horn, which despite being a brass instrument is considered a woodwind, and first chair flute player from the orchestra, and then sometimes not, clarinet. And I would sit there enthralled just by the sound of it,
Yeah.
and that was a huge influence on me. So I never really heard any recorded music, and to any extent, till I was in high school.
Wow.
My exposure was entirely to live music, by real people in the same room that I was in.
Well, you're lucky,
Yeah.
And I don't. Obviously I don't know what it's like to be a kid growing up now, but I, just walking through the world day to day as an adult, we are constantly hit with audio, absolutely constantly. I mean, my wife is keenly aware of where we can and cannot eat in restaurants based on the music, or how long I can walk through a CVS to the grocery store before I become utterly irritated.
Yeah.
And it's because we're just constantly being hit with these things. And
Yeah, where did the concept of music being background noise come from?
it's probably, in my guess, would be the grocery store, right? Because when we were kids, they had this muzak that played in the grocery stores, and they were, orchestral arrangements of to tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree or whatever.
Yeah.
And that was somehow supposed to stimulate your spending, whatever, your instincts to spend more money. You look, I like this song, I'm going to go get an extra grapefruit. I don't know. I remember when we were kids, people used to complain about the music in these places. And at some point, it changed, because I worked at a grocery store when I was 16 years old, and they still had that then. I know that's dating me a little bit. And then I think within a few years after that, they switched into playing more pop or rock and roll stuff. Somebody had obviously done some market research and decided that, this is what's going to make people spend more money on canned goods or whatever. When I was 18, I had just sort of gotten into contemporary jazz stuff, like John Scofield and Pat Metheny and what Miles Davis was doing, that sort of stuff, Mike Stern, these guys, a lot of guitar players. I thought that was a really exciting time in music. It felt like this real forward momentum in how people played and the new ideas that they were coming up with. There was radio markets that were supporting this sort of thing. We had 101.9 in New York City. You remember those guys?
CD 101.9.
Yeah, that was
and Miles Davis was on the advertisement that you saw on TV for the radio station.
It was incredible. Yeah. And there was this conference every year in Colorado called the Conference on World Affairs. It would be days, during the day you'd have these panels, and they'd pick a topic and throw just random people on the panel, like way outside your own realm of expertise. And in the music world, it was Johnny Mandel was there, and Peter Appleyard. God, I couldn't even remember all these guys. But the main guy was Dave Grusin, who, of course, is one of the most prolific film composers of all time, and one of my favorite jazz pianists. Just, tons of admiration for this guy. Dave had Grusin Rosen Productions, which was GRP. This was sort of the modern jazz label. He had just sold that label to MCA for $20 million. This is what, 1990? 89, 90, somewhere around that. I mean, to think that you could make that much money as a jazz artist back then is unbelievable. This was a cultural movement. It really was. And so I decided this is where I want to spend my career. This is really what I want to do. I want to learn to play this music, and it intersected with the pop industry a lot, because a lot of these players were playing on rock records and pop records and stuff. You remember, you must have been constantly in sessions with these guys.
Well, yeah, I mean, all the great studio musicians were all jazz musicians.
Yeah.
Those are the guys that made all the hit records.
Right. So then one day, this company popped up out of Princeton called Broadcast Architecture. And they said, well, we'll do this, testing to see what people really want. And smooth jazz was born. And that just came in and usurped the contemporary jazz industry. And their objective was to sell advertising. They didn't care about anything else. Mm-hmm. And over the course of several years, this was whittled down further and further into, well, it has to have a drum beat out of this particular sample pack. And, these are the formats of the tunes. And if you're going to do a solo, it has to be this way. They just ground the life out of the whole thing. And I remember at the time, people that we were working with in the rock side of the business were laughing. Oh, you got to play smooth jazz gigs and stuff. I was like, be careful, because this is going to happen to you. Mm-hmm. The same thing's going to happen in this part of the business. It's coming. They only want to sell advertising. And sure enough, 10 years later, we wound up into the sort of Britney Spears era of things, and it's never recovered. And this affects audio in my mind, because if you have a TV ad slot and it's 30 seconds and it's during a football game, and what you need to do is sell a smartphone or sell a car, you have to make things as loud and obnoxious and attention-getting as possible. When you use those same objectives to produce music, then the point is to sell you something. It's not for you. It's for them. And I think that's kind of how we wound up where we are now in the business, and with production techniques and the loudness wars, and mm-hmm. And ultimately I think people have lost a lot of interest in new music because the reason it was designed. Now, I don't think the artists go out there and say, oh, well, I'm going to make a song that's going to sell a Hyundai. I don't think that's what they're thinking at all. But the fact is, the tools that they're given to, make their records were designed for that, really, or evolved to be designed for that over many years.
For me, for recording, my goal has always been to provide the best experience for the listener, disregarding the musical content, but just taking a viewpoint from the engineering side of it. And that's completely at odds with what you just described. Isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is, yeah. I think that's, that's the problem we face now. I think also, when we've talked about this recently, I also think that's possibly going to be changed by Atmos and the spatial audio thing. I think that's the thing that may just come along and save all of this.
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I talked to Dale Becker about Atmos on this podcast, and his enthusiasm for the format really got me enthusiastic about learning more about it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I talked to him about it as well, and he brought up all the points that I would have guessed would be the things that would make it successful.
Yeah.
And he's been working with it from the beginning, really, and I would think that if there's any master in that exists today, it would be him.
Yeah. Well, let's circle back to the concept of quality audio and what goes into making that. In my mind, I can think of several things that are really important. First of which, of course, is the music itself, because if you don't have that, what's the point of any of the rest of it?
Right.
And then a large category we'll call the recording technique, which takes into account the room, which I think is, vitally important in the sound of records, or should be anyway. And then microphone choice and placement, and then all the other equipment that's used, and ultimately down to the recording format. And I'm curious to know, because you guys got started in recording your own music fairly early in your musical career. How did you develop your sense of how to do that? What was the way you approach it to get the most effective recording?
It's been a long, long process.
Trial and error.
Yeah, a lot of trial and error. I mean, I remember, starting out recording, my dad had one of those old Sony reel-to-reels, like a consumer thing. And we would record band practices and odds and ends to that and hang a lot of mics. I don't know how concerned we were with sound quality so much as just capturing, hey, this is our band. Now we can listen back to our rehearsal. But it wasn't too many years after that we got into working in recording studios and being in those kind of environments where you're actually starting to pay attention to sound quality. I think once you got into a recording studio as a young person, all of a sudden you had a lot more moving parts. Because, you go back to the song and then, why does the drummer keep dragging? And the snare sounds terrible anyway. And, what's the special effect that he's got on the mix? It sounds neat. There's so many different aspects, things to analyze before you start to whittle down what it is actually you want to hear in the recording and what you want to get out of it. So did the song get captured well? Is it the right tempo? Is it something I can actually listen back to or play for somebody else and not cringe when I hear it? So we started working in these studios, and then as technology progressed, the ADAT really changed a lot of things, because you could take an ADAT and throw it in your apartment, and all of a sudden you had 8 tracks of audio in a couple rack spaces. Things became a lot easier, and so many people nowadays look at like the DAW as the only approach that they've ever had to recording anything, not really understanding that, actually realizing the capability of what the DAW does. It does your mixing, and it does all these effects, and it does. 20 years ago, even if you had an ADAT, you still needed a mixer, you still needed ways to deal with the workflow of what you're trying to do. But I think we always try to keep up with, I hate to say the latest trends, but advancing technology, certainly. We always try to make better sounding records than the ones that we had just finished or were even currently working on. I can think of getting to the ends of projects, and the last song on the record, was like such a stretch to pull out, but it was so drastically different from the rest of the record because of all the things that we had learned, 8 tracks before that. Mm-hmm. Again, it's a lot of moving parts. It's what you want to hear, and musically speaking, and the parts that you play and the way that you approach playing your instrument, and then dealing with converter quality and microphone preamps. And hey, I discovered that there's this cool thing called a ribbon microphone. Cheaper condenser microphones had come along in the late 90s, and they were like revolutionary because all of a sudden people with no money could afford a decent sounding microphone. I think when the 2000s hit, then we sort of swung back the other way. There's a lot more awareness about the technologies and things available. You think of a ribbon mic, that they existed long before condenser microphones, but we didn't know what a ribbon mic was until we'd been recording for many years. We knew you had like a 57 or a 58. That's a dynamic mic. Those are cheap mics. We never use those in the studio. I would say the ribbon mic, although I think for instance, the R44 we're using here embraces technology because he's got the neodymium magnets in it, and it's really sort of an optimized version of, an older design. I don't know, maybe it is embracing technology and trying to always be on the the cutting edge of things, always trying to do things better. And a lot of the time when we're working even on products, this is sort of another tangent, but anytime I order a power supply board, I'd take a look at the PCB of what we've got, and it's like, how can I make this just that tiny little bit better? Mm-hmm. Even if it's, if I move this little piece of silkscreen here, then surely nobody will make a mistake putting it together then, you know? Uh-huh. So, but it's that way with everything. I mean, it's that way with the cars we drive too. Mm-hmm. You know, it's that way with the coffee I drink in the morning. Mm-hmm. I started out drinking terrible coffee. I'd never go back to that now.
Well, you know, a lot of this for us was very much limited by economics. When I was a teenager, I was like huge into Howard Jones and a lot of these, you know, synth pop guys. And I loved keyboards. I just wanted synthesizers. And man, you've never mowed so many lawns in your life. Like nowadays, kids are like, oh yeah, I have this emulation of this whatever Oberheim. Like we didn't have that. You want an Oberheim? I don't know what you would have to do to get an Oberheim when I was a teenager.
Yeah, unless you were in the room with the thing, you didn't hear it.
Yeah, you never even got close to it. I mean, there were rumors about, oh, I heard they used this on that record, but you know that actually was interesting because that changed the dynamic in the business. You know, because if you were an artist, even in New York, and you were working on a record and you wanted an emulator too, I need this track. Either if you had a big enough record deal, they would rent it and bring it in. Otherwise, you had to network with people. You had to know who had what. You know, I mean, I see these pictures of Jason Miles from back then when he was doing sessions in New York. And man, his keyboard rig was like...
I know, outrageous.
Tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, this was super expensive stuff to even just to maintain that stuff. I mean, carrying it around. So, I mean, if you knew Jason and you wanted that sound on your record, you know, you went to him because he had this stuff. Or maybe you
knew how to play it.
Right. Yeah, knew how to program it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we were borrowing and stealing everything we could back then. I mean, my first recording I did with a friend of mine, we had a 57 and 2 tape decks. One of them had a little dub side on the tape deck. And we had a small combo bass amp or guitar amp or something like that, and another guitar amp. And he was a drummer, and we recorded the first pass with me playing, you know, guitar while he's playing drums. And then we came back with the other tape deck, played the one tape deck through the combo amp, you know, and by the time we were done, I mean, it was a viable recording, but the noise floor was as high as the music was. Yeah. But I remember recording my rock band in high school. I had a pretty serious rock band in high school. The drummer was you know, in his mid-30s. He was a Black Rock Coalition guy, Jerome Tyus. I mean, he was a working guy, and he was just like, oh, these kids are cool. I'm going to play with them. And we did demos mono on a tape deck with a single 57 hanging from the ceiling like this. You know, these ceiling tiles would just loop the cord around because, of course, we didn't have the right kind of mic stand. And so, and the singer was standing this far from it so the vocals would be loud enough. Mm-hmm. And those demos were dubbed and spread all over the place. I mean, that was a viable recording back then. I mean, I haven't heard that in decades, and I can't imagine what it would sound like, but...
Well, there's something to be said for a single point pickup.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, and that's sort of the way our style of recording is trending.
Sure.
Is to use as few mics as possible.
Right. And it is great. I mean, it forces you to get it right in the room. Right. I mean, if all you have to capture an entire band, singer and all, is one SM57, then the balance of the players has to be perfectly right. All the sounds have to be perfectly right. All the parts have to be perfectly right. And so it makes you iron out the rest of the process before you hit record.
Right.
Which is great. You know, I think that a lot of that is lost with DAWs because it's this, let's just get everything we can and we'll figure out how to do this later. And so it pushes decisions on to the next guy who's got to mix or master this thing and make it sound like something. You know, that's been lost. So for us, I mean, a lot of this has been a distillation process of what do we really need? And, we wound up, with all this gear because we figured out that 2 channels of VT2 or whatever trumped 16 channels of whatever else it was that we were using. We realized, wait, we actually don't need 13 mics on a drum kit. We can do this with 2.
Right. Well, Geoff, you also developed a great deal of technical knowledge and ability to build things along the way. How did
I
that
still
start?
am.
Yeah, I know. But I'm curious to know how that started. Was that a necessity?
Well, a lot of, with our progression through trying to make better records, I ended up building a lot of the gear that we used for them because, we would get a little bit of money from a project, turn it into some gear. I guess ultimately it just wouldn't be enough or good enough. So we'd sell whatever we bought and turn that into other things. Eventually it became turning gear money into parts. And putting things together. As far as the whole picture is concerned, I don't know. I try to learn new things every day, and I think you've said it before. It's like if you're not, you're kind of not doing something right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of the technical stuff is just paying attention to how other people do it, and if you build 100 microphone preamps, you're going to learn what works and what doesn't. What goes best, things that you'd like to change to make your job a little bit easier. A lot of the times we talk about it'd be great to have a compressor with one knob. I always think in my mind that one of these days I'm going to design all the, work out all the little kinks in, say, putting a VT2 together to just be one piece of wire that, connects from the input to the output and we're done. I just got to get all the stuff in between,
That was a huge discovery for us. Geoff got in electronics, I think, initially because we had all this vintage gear and it just broke all the time. You can't just send a vintage synthesizer or something like that off to a repair shop and expect that you're going to see it sometime in the next 8 months or whatever.
In the 90s were notorious. Oh, you drop an amp off to repair a jack and you'd be lucky if you saw it 3 months later.
Yeah, and so one day he said, I'm going to take a crack at fixing this thing. I said, you can do that? He said, well, electronics repair guys do it. How hard can it be? And I thought, having known some of these guys, yeah, that's a pretty good point. It started with that and then went into, hey, wait, I can build these other things that we need. He called me one day and said, I can build these, API 312 kits.
For somebody who was just starting out or even fairly well into their career, what advice would you have for them for training themselves to hear the kinds of things we've been talking about? How do you go about doing that?
Go see live music. And when I mean live music, I do not mean going to see a rock band in a rock club.
Yeah.
What I mean is go see the symphony, go see, chamber groups, go see jazz groups.
Organ recitals.
Organ recitals are great. Yeah, choral recitals. Go hear what a violin sounds like in a room, in a good room. A good violinist on a $500,000 violin in a good room. Go figure that out because there's something to that. Even just that. Think about that. You can spend $100,000 on a bow. The bow doesn't resonate. It doesn't make any noise. You can spend $10 on a bow. Go try to figure out why that violinist is playing a $100,000 bow. There's a good reason. Go figure out acoustic instruments. Figure out why, a Martin guitar is a Martin guitar. There's reasons for that. Go figure out why a Steinway is a Steinway. There's reasons for that. There's reasons that people who have trained their ears to hear the difference in these things gravitate towards those types of instruments.
Yeah, when I had my studio, commercial studio, once a year I would take the whole staff, wasn't that many people, fewer than a dozen people, I'd take them all to a Philadelphia orchestra concert. Some of the people were looking forward to going, others said, I don't like that kind of music, I don't want to go. But, I made them go. And I said, listen, because this is going to help you in your job to be exposed to what really good music sounds like. And I don't care whether you like the piece or not, or whether you like this style of music or not. Just listen to the sound of it in a really good room. I think that really made an impression on people because some of them had never been exposed to anything like that. They were good engineers. They did great work and had a successful career. But I think they got even better after they realized that there was more to their training than they thought.
Yeah, yeah. You know, that sort of, you brought up an interesting point, and that is judging music by its style. Oh, I don't really like that kind of music. Are you sure? I mean, I'm going to give you an example, and I'm sure there are people who are going to hate me for saying this. Star Wars was a mediocre movie with the greatest orchestral score in history. It's a musical. You know, you take that away, it's not the same. That was the point of the movie. It was a musical. You needed to be able to take in what that was. That's what created the excitement in this movie. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of great music in the new Star Wars movies, but this is John Williams you're talking about. That's what that's about. Don't judge it. That's classical music. I mean, he was coming at it from, you know, Wagner's point of view or whatever. That's classical music. Don't say it's not your thing, because you're exposed to all kinds of it, and it has an emotional impact on you. You just might not be aware of it. I never try to judge what I'm hearing based on style points of things. You know, style points are fleeting. You know, they come and go. The core of things is what matters. I mean, I've heard recordings of punk bands that I thought were absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I'm not into that kind of music, but you can't deny it when somebody's done great work like that. You know, and I've heard a lot of stuff in genres that I tend to gravitate towards more that are just completely flat and uninspiring.
Well, can you quantify what makes the difference?
How well the producers, the engineers, and the artists themselves have captured the spirit of their artistic intent and its emotional content. However it is that you achieve that.
Yeah, well, that implies first that everybody involved fully understands what the piece is and where it's going.
Or cares about it or is invested in it.
Right. Yeah.
Sure. Right. And doesn't make judgment calls about it because, oh, I don't like that kind of thing or whatever. I noticed a phenomenon working on projects that I got dialed into this some years back. A lot of the time when you hit something that's really, really on mark, it makes people uncomfortable. Where, you know, you played something, it was something that was not within the realm of expectation of everybody in the room. Or maybe it was a style point from something that was seemingly unrelated, and the artist says, I don't know, I don't like that. Really? Because that's really what hits. And I see a lot of artists shoot themselves in the foot because they won't let that stuff go through.
You know, just in terms of listening, and I'll just take one example, and that's the acoustic environment. This is something I believe anybody can learn if they're interested in learning about it, and that is to just pay attention. I find if I'm working on a project, especially on a mix, and I'm listening to it over and over and over again, and this generally doesn't occur with the kinds of projects we do, but, you know, if I'm doing somebody else's project, helping them out, I'm really attuned to the reverbs I'm using, the delays I'm using, and all that, to try to recreate some sort of sense of space that didn't exist in the original recording.
Right.
And I find that when I'm done with that and I go home, suddenly my whole house is delays and reverbs. You know, and I hear things that I knew they were there, but I never paid that much attention to. And it's just like overwhelming just how much my ears were tuned into listening to those things. So I know that it's entirely possible for people to, consciously try to do that, to listen to the room that they're in. Close your eyes, picture the room, walking around in it with your eyes closed, and just see how does it change when you walk through the room.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be a studio, but it's really interesting in a studio because that should be a place where the acoustics are really nice. But even in the best studios, there's always places where
it doesn't sound very good.
yeah, it doesn't sound good. I think when people get to the point where they realize, that they can hear those things if they just make some effort to learn.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think actually you're making an effort not to hear those things most of the time because it's distracting. You tune out. Geoff and I, the house that we grew up in was the darkest place in the world. I have no explanation for this, but it's basically the top of a mountain, I guess, right? In Princeton. I mean, if there is such a thing.
In New Jersey.
Yeah, it's the highest peak there in the woods and surrounded by a state park. And even now when I drive through there, which I don't do more than maybe once a year, at nighttime, it just sucks the lights out of the headlights of your car. I mean, it's just impossibly dark up there. We never had any lights on. We just walked around in the dark all the time. And so I kind of developed a little bit of a sense of acoustics just to navigate through rooms in the house or navigate outside or wherever I was, just to sort of help get a sense of where I was.
Right, exactly. And of course, people that are sightless to begin with develop this, to an amazing degree. Mm-hmm. But I just read some research recently where they tried people that were sighted and put some sort of eye patches on them so they completely blocked out all the light and had them try to learn to navigate their world without any sight. And it didn't take them long at all until they got really good at it.
Right.
So it's definitely an intrinsic part of our brain that we just need to capitalize on.
Right. That brings up another interesting point, which has come up in conversation a lot with a bunch of our colleagues, is as an engineer, you're working in front of a computer screen and there's all these colors and the plugins have these pictures and stuff and all this. This is affecting what you're hearing.
Yep. Try
to work with that stuff shut off.
Right.
When you're tracking, turn it off. Turn off the screen.
Right.
That
or at least close your eyes.
Yeah, or whatever. You don't want that influencing what you're processing.
No, you certainly don't want process of producing music to become a visual endeavor. There's a temptation to do that because you see what's rolling by on the screen and relate that to what you're hearing. And eventually you can't separate the two.
Right.
And the people at home don't have that opportunity to see those waveforms. Mm-hmm. Not that they ever should for any reason. It's a distraction that I think influences how you record and to the detriment of how you record.
Mm-hmm. Well, the opposite of this is true too. If you are applying video to the sound of a musical piece or whatever, it changes how you absorb that. Like take Star Wars, right? You put all the spaceships and robots and stuff on top of Wagner, and all of a sudden Wagner is totally a viable aesthetic in your world.
Yeah.
Whereas you're probably not willing to sit through the ring cycle.
Right.
Yeah, I think that partially explains I wouldn't say objection, but my disinterest in music videos, because I don't want a visual image telling me what I'm supposed to experience. Although I have to admit that a lot of times the video can be better than the music.
Oh, sure, yeah.
They really do an excellent job on some of those, but I also find a lot of times the visual content has nothing to do with the musical content.
Right, yeah.
And I just find that so disconcerting that, I'm either going to watch it or I'm going to listen to it. I can't do both.
Yeah, right.
Well, Geoff, you've mostly played stringed instruments, fretless stringed instruments.
Right.
So what was the secret for you for developing your ear to know, when you were in pitch and, from the very beginning. Because,
Yeah.
And now I'm sure it's just, you
Right.
never give it a second
I think
thought.
singing is such a
a
big thing, because it's just an instant connection internally. I mean, even between your voice and your ears, there's something that happens inside of you that it's instant. And when I play now, like I hear what I'm playing before I play it. Mm-hmm. My hands sort of inherently know where to go. It's a fully functioning system, totally integrated.
Right.
Luckily.
Yeah.
Because, if it weren't, I wouldn't be able to sing or play in tune or anything. So having those things internally is important. And then I think it actually takes more time to learn how to listen to interact with the outside world.
And it brings up an interesting point, and that is, except for rhythmic stuff, all music is just really an extension of your voice. I learned that from Louis Armstrong, who one time said in an interview, I guess somebody was asking him, some stupid journalist question like, how do you know what to play, or something stupid like that.
Right.
And he just said, I'm not playing, I'm just singing through my trumpet or cornet, or whatever he was playing,
Right.
And if you listen to him, you hear that,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for most music, that's really true. It's just an extension of your singing voice.
Sure, yeah.
For me, I always regret that I've never developed the ability to sing to my standards. Because I have a really good sense of pitch, and I know if something's off even the slightest amount. And I just can't stand the sound of it when I try to sing something. Even though I had 2 years of solfege training,
God.
which, is sight reading.
Better you than me.
Yeah, which I did not enjoy, and sort of taught me that I probably would take much more effort than I was willing to put into it to be good at it. But it really did develop my ear. Mm-hmm. It was really good for that.
I mean, the only other thing I was going to say is, with all the gear that we owned over all the years and all the upgrades we made, things really only ever got smaller. We just wound up with less and less and less stuff all the time. Fewer preamps,
better things, but less of them. Yeah.
I mean, at the point that we did the full plunge, we were at it was Avatar at the time. Is it Power Station again now? I think it's called Power Station.
Yeah, they changed it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In New York, doing that record with Ultra Nouveau, and we brought a bunch of our own gear. So we went in there with our PMCs. And we had a VT-24 with us and a handful of microphones. And I guess we had a few preamps in a 500 series box, right? I can't even remember what they were.
Yeah, I don't know what they were.
And we got home, and I said to Geoff, do we really need anything else? What? Can we just get another 4 channels of this? And we had about an hour deliberation about that. And then we rounded up everything in the studio and sold it. Like every compressor, every the preamp.
Thing.
And when we were done, the only outboard gear we had was a pair of VT-24s. That was it. Mm-hmm. There was nothing else. Looking back at the records that we made over the years, if we had a pair of Coles and a VT2, we would have been better off the entire time. Yeah. And that would not have been more expensive than what we had. We had tons of stuff.
Right.
I mean, the studio was so full at one point that it was chest high in 3 rows. You couldn't even see across the room. There was so much stuff in there. And by the time we were done, that was it. We had 2 preamps, and a few microphones that we liked. We bought that pair of Coles, and I thought, oh my God, I can't believe we spent this much money on a pair of mics. And of course, they were the only mics that we used after that for a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just don't need stuff.
I've been talking with Geoff and George Hazelrigg. Our conversation continues with a discussion of DSD, digital audio recording, a high-resolution format that the 3 of us use whenever practical. Our thoughts on DSD will be heard in an upcoming episode. As always, thanks for listening. Your comments and suggestions are always helpful to me. You can contact me at dwfern@dwfern.com. And please subscribe to this podcast using any of the 30 or more podcast providers that carry it. Leave a review if you like, and please tell others about this podcast. Thanks. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.